The cursor blinked against the black background of the screen. Sarah Collins sat in the center of her home office, the only sound the steady, rhythmic hum of the cooling fan. She refreshed the browser page. The number remained, $1 million. Her finger hovered over the mouse, motionless. It was a clean, round figure, yet it felt heavy with the weight of the last decade. She looked away from the monitor, letting her gaze drift to the window where the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on. The silence of the house felt absolute. She reached out and tapped the screen near the balance, then dragged her finger down to the transaction history archives. She scrolled back, past the thousands of entries, until the list stopped at the very beginning. $50. That was the first deposit. It was a sum scraped together from a paycheck that had barely covered the rent. She stared at that small, singular transaction until the numbers blurred. It had started with that minor, desperate transfer, a tiny fraction of what now sat before her. She leaned back, the chair springs creaking in the quiet room, and watched the cursor continue its relentless, steady pulse. The memory of the past did not come as a wave, but as a series of sharp, jagged edges. She remembered the rusted sedan in the parking lot, its engine coughing to life with a metallic grind that echoed in her chest every morning. She watched her colleagues pull away in luxury vehicles, their windows tinted and smooth, while she gripped a steering wheel that felt like it was shedding its skin under her palms. She would arrive at her desk to answer emails for 10 hours, a cycle that never seemed to move forward. At home, her parents had spent 30 years preaching the virtue of hard work, yet their bank accounts remained perpetually empty. She saw the same patterns repeating in her own life, a tightening knot she could not untie. Every paycheck went to rent, utilities, and the basic cost of survival. There was no surplus, there was no breathing room. She felt the weight of those empty accounts like a physical pressure, a suffocating anticipation of a future that looked exactly like the past. She was running on a treadmill that offered no distance, and the realization that she was destined for the same stagnation as those who raised her became an unbearable, constant hum in the back of her mind. The turning point arrived not with a shout, but with the quiet turning of a page. Sarah pulled a worn book from the back of her shelf, its spine cracked from years of neglect. She sat on the floor, the floorboards cold beneath her, and opened it to a dog-eared section she had ignored for months. Her eyes tracked the lines until they locked onto a single sharp command. Riches come to those who develop a plan. She read it 3 times. The words stripped away the noise of her daily exhaustion. She looked at her bank app on her phone, then back at the page. The realization was visceral, a sudden alignment of gears in her mind. She stopped seeing her paycheck as a lifeline for survival, and started seeing it as raw material. The cycle that had felt like a cage suddenly looked like a series of variables waiting to be solved. She tossed the phone aside, stood up, and walked to her desk. She didn't feel a sudden rush of hope. She felt a cold, calculated clarity. The panic of the past dissolved into a singular question: how to build the structure. She grabbed a notebook and a pen. She began to draw lines, columns, and targets. The shift was absolute. She was no longer waiting for a break. She was designing the exit. Sarah opened a blank spreadsheet on her desktop, the cursor blinking rhythmically against the white grid. She didn't rely on intuition or market rumors. She treated her portfolio with the same cold, procedural logic she applied to her most difficult customer support tickets. Every month, the moment her salary hit her account, she executed a preset transfer. A fixed, non-negotiable percentage moved directly into a low-cost index fund. She ignored the temptation to upgrade her lifestyle or indulge in impulsive purchases. When the urge to spend flared, she opened the spreadsheet instead, inputting the numbers and watching the projected growth lines extend into the future. It was a monotonous, repetitive loop. She automated the contributions, ensuring the process ran without her direct intervention. She stopped checking the daily fluctuations entirely. Her focus shifted from the balance itself to the integrity of the system. If the data was accurate and the contributions were consistent, the outcome was mathematically inevitable. She viewed her financial future as a series of resolved tickets. Identify the task, execute the step, and move to the next. The system was now the engine of her life, and she was merely the operator, keeping the gears clean and the momentum moving forward. The 3rd year began with steady, rhythmic progress. Then, the global indices fractured. It started as a ripple in the morning news, a red arrow pointing downward on the screen. By noon, the office air had changed. The hum of the computers was drowned out by the rising pitch of voices. Her co-workers gathered in the break room, clutching their phones, faces pale as the headlines screamed of impending doom. The word collapse echoed across the desks. One co-worker slammed his hand against his monitor, pointing at a plummeting chart. "Sell everything!" he shouted, his voice cracking with the raw pressure of fear. Sarah sat at her own workstation, the silence of her desk a stark contrast to the surrounding hysteria. She watched the ticker tape run across the bottom of her screen, each number lower than the last. The air in the room felt thin, heavy with the weight of lost security. She observed the panic spreading like a contagion, people frantically logging into accounts and frantically dumping assets. The market was bleeding, and the room was full of people desperate to stop the wound from deepening. Sarah kept her hands on her keyboard, watching the red numbers cycle, waiting for the system to test her resolve. The panic hit a fever pitch. A colleague rushed past her desk, frantic, yelling about the total loss of his retirement savings. Sarah did not look up. She felt the vibration of footsteps on the floor and the sharp, jagged cadence of voices around her, but she remained anchored to her chair. She opened her brokerage application. The interface was steady, indifferent to the chaos echoing through the office. She saw the prices dropping, the red percentages deepening, and she felt the weight of the moment. Instead of the fear that gripped her peers, she felt a cold clarity. She did not hesitate. She moved the cursor to the buy button. She increased her allocation, funneling every spare cent she had accumulated into the market. A coworker stopped nearby, staring at her screen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you insane? Everything is burning," he stammered. Sarah simply clicked the confirmation. The transaction processed with a soft chime. She had not bought into the fear. She had bought into the math. She closed the app, leaned back, and returned to her emails, the noise of the office fading into the background as the system performed exactly as she had planned. The market crash faded from the headlines, but the grind remained. The first 5 years of this new life were defined by silence. Every month, her account balance looked nearly identical to the last. There were no spikes, no dramatic gains, just the slow, steady hum of the system. She found herself staring at the screen late at night, watching the numbers crawl forward at a pace that felt like watching grass grow. The temptation to break the pattern was a constant pressure. Friends invited the sister weekend trips. She calculated the cost, looked at her spreadsheet, and stayed home to read. She canceled every subscription that offered even a hint of convenience. She stopped eating out entirely, replacing restaurant meals with a rotation of bulk-bought staples. She treated her finances like a neglected, high-priority support ticket that required constant, boring maintenance. Every paycheck was a fresh test. She deposited a fixed percentage, watched the balance tick up by a fraction, and repeated the process. It was a monotonous cycle of deferred gratification. There was no applause for the sacrifice, no recognition for the discipline. She simply kept typing, kept answering emails, and kept funneling her life force into the index fund, waiting for the invisible math to finally catch fire. The shift did not happen with a bang, but with a quiet, jarring discrepancy. Sarah sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to input the monthly contribution. She looked at the total. She blinked. She checked the spreadsheet again, tracing the rows of data with a pen. The balance had grown by an amount that defied her previous projections. It was more than her entire monthly paycheck. She sat back, the air in the room suddenly feeling thin. For years, she had pushed the stone up the hill with her own hands. Now, the stone was rolling on its own. She watched the screen as the index fund ticked upward, the growth cycle self-sustaining. She had expected a slow climb, but the math had finally hit the inflection point. Her money was working while she stared at the wall, generating value in the digital ether. She looked at her hands, then back at the screen. The paycheck was no longer the primary engine of her security. It was the capital itself, feeding on its own momentum. She realized then that the grind had ended. She leaned forward, not to type, but to watch the numbers climb, witnessing the exact moment her past discipline finally eclipsed her present effort. The numbers on the screen blurred as they raced upward, finally slowing to a rhythmic, steady crawl. Sarah didn't look away. She watched the final digit flip. The total balance hit $1 million. The room went silent, the hum of the cooling fan suddenly sounding distant. She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking under her weight. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the monitor, remembering the first deposit, $50, scraped from a paycheck that barely covered rent. That $50 had felt like a mountain. This million felt like a map. The cycle of poverty that had tightened around her parents, the one she feared would consume her own life, had simply dissolved. It was gone. She looked at her hands, still resting on the desk, and then back at the seven-figure sum. There was no sudden rush, no urge to shout, only a deep, heavy sense of finality. She had proven that the path to this number was not paved with luck or windfalls, but with the thousands of small, boring, repetitive choices she made every single month. She had hacked the system, one paycheck at a time, until the math finally broke the ceiling. The screen glowed, steady and absolute. Sarah stood up, the chair pushing back against the floor with a sharp, clear sound. She did not throw a party. She did not reach for the phone to tell anyone. She closed the laptop, the screen going black, and walked to the kitchen. The house was quiet. She filled the kettle, watching the water rise, and set it on the base. It began to hum, a low vibration that eventually climbed into a sharp, steady whistle. She took a single mug from the cabinet, placed a tea bag inside, and poured the steaming water. The steam rose, curling into the cool air of the room. She held the mug, feeling the heat seep through the ceramic into her palms. It was just a cup of tea. It was the same process she had followed every evening for years. She realized then that the millions were not the point. The point was the consistency. The point was the ability to choose the next step every single day, regardless of the noise outside. She had reached this moment not through a sudden miracle, but through thousands of small, invisible decisions. Realized freedom was not a destination. It was the quiet, deliberate habit of staying the course, one paycheck, 1 month, and one cup of tea at a time.